Good evening, everybody. My name is Trey Grayson. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics here at Harvard. I want to welcome everybody. Tonight is our first forum in a series of forums about the presidential election for 2012. And we are beginning tonight with a discussion of our voting laws. We're going to talk a lot about voter ID, but not just voter ID. Back in the 2000 election, we wouldn't be having these kinds of discussions. People didn't pay much attention to election administration and election laws. And we all know what happened. Even the freshmen at the college who are a little young to remember 2000 have studied it ever since. And since 2000, we've been talking a lot about how we administer our elections and what the rules should be, or could be, or ought to be. And in this particular election, there's been a big focus on law changes at the state level and what impact they may have and the need or lack thereof for some of these changes. So I think we're going to have a robust discussion tonight. For those of you who don't know, I used to be the Secretary of State of Kentucky, so I'm really excited to be able to merge my old job as the election guy in Kentucky and my new job as the politics and election guy here at Harvard. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. And we're glad to have all of you here and want to pay a special welcome to the freshmen and the first-year graduate students who are here tonight. We're excited to have you, and we look forward to seeing you all throughout the semester and throughout the year. And you have programs, so you have more detailed bios of our panelists. I'm just going to do a brief bio, and we'll introduce all of them right off the top, and then we'll dive into our discussion. To my immediate left is Tova Wang. Tova is the author of a new book entitled The Politics of Voter Suppression. We urge you to leave here tonight immediately when you're finished and go buy it at the Coop or the Harvard Bookstore or order it on Amazon.com. She's a senior fellow, democracy fellow at Demos, as well as at the Century Foundation. To her immediate left is John Fund. John also has a new book. You can buy his book as well. It's called Who's Counting? Available at the same places. Has written more publications, most recently with National Review Online. Next is Jennie Bowser. Jennie is a senior fellow with the National Conference of State Legislatures. She came to Harvard back in the spring and did a good job presenting on this topic, so we invited her to come back all the way from Denver, Colorado. So we're glad to have you, Jennie. And finally, Alex Keyssar. Alex is the Matthew Stirling Professor of History and Social Policy here at the Kennedy School. And so any of his students, you get extra credit for being here tonight. Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. But we're glad to have all of them here. I wanted to begin with Jennie. NCSL, that's the abbreviation for the National Council on State Legislatures, is a nonpartisan organization that looks at laws passed by state legislatures, considered by state legislatures. And so I want Jennie to begin with kind of an overview of what's going on in the states to bring everybody up to speed so then we can have a more robust discussion. So, Jennie.
Thanks, Trey. So what Trey said, that in 2000, going into the presidential election, nobody would even be talking about this, is absolutely true. At NCSL, we didn't really cover election issues until 2000, when Florida 2000 happened. And that's because it was sort of a backseat issue for most legislatures. It just wasn't really talked about. It wasn't really controversial. There wasn't a lot of change from one year to the next. But beginning in 2001, I started tracking election administration legislation in the states and have done that ever since. And what I found is that in a typical biennium, we see 400 or so, 400 give or take 50, election bills become law. Most of those are non-controversial, and I could tell you about them, but I'd probably put you to sleep because they are the nuts and bolts of implementing elections. They're not exciting, and they're not really partisan. This year, we saw more like about 500, not this year, I'm sorry, this biennium, 2011 and 2012 put together, about 500 election bills became law. So it's a little bit higher in volume than it has been over the past decade. But what's really different about this year is the politicization of election administration in state legislatures. It's been growing ever since 2000, but it really has shot up this year. And I have three particular issues that I will use to illustrate this. One would be the regulation of voter registration drives. I'm talking about when groups like ACORN or the League of Women Voters go out and get voters registered. States have been attempting, actually over the past decade really, to regulate these drives fairly quietly until this year. And then this year we had two states implement regulations that have been very controversial, particularly in Florida, where they said if you take in a voter registration form, you have 48 hours to turn it over to election officials. And this was so onerous to groups like the League of Women Voters that they stopped registering voters in Florida this year. They said they couldn't comply with that. The other state was Texas, where they said you can't pay people based on how many voters they get registered. These, though, are really the two examples this year of controversial moves in this area. And like I said, it's been going on for about a decade, fairly quietly in most states. The second area is early voting. about, I think it's 8 or 9 states acted over the last 2 years to shorten the period during which voters can vote before Election Day. The really controversial change has been taking away early voting on the weekend right before the election. In a lot of states, that's when a lot of people go out and vote early. Over the past decade, the trend has been in the opposite direction. We've seen about half of the states implement an absentee voting program or an early voting program or expand an existing program. So this year's 180 on that has been notable, but still pales in comparison when you're talking about partisanship and controversy to the issue of voter ID. In 2000, in that presidential election, we had 14 states that had a voter ID law in place, and none of those were strict photo ID. Let me pause just for a second to define that term so everybody knows what I'm talking about. Photo ID, that's pretty obvious. The ID you show to vote has to have a photo on it. In most cases, it has to be a government-issued photo ID, like a driver's license or passport. The strict piece is where it gets confusing. In the strict states, either you show an ID on Election Day and vote a regular ballot, or you vote on a provisional ballot, which only gets counted if you come back within a few days and show an ID. So we call it strict because it's essentially no ID, no vote. So in 2014 states with voter ID laws, none of them strict. That went up to 19 states in 2004. In 2008, it was up to 23 states, and 2 of those, Georgia and Indiana, were strict photo. This year, it could be as high as 33, and as many as 9 of those could be strict photo. I have to hedge the numbers a little bit because some of these are caught up in court, and it's not entirely clear right now what will be in effect on Election Day. But these are highly controversial bills. The partisan divide on this couldn't possibly be starker from me trying to be nonpartisan on this issue. I feel like I'm walking on a razor blade down the middle. It is just as partisan as an election issue gets. And to see this many states, 10 states over 2 years, plus 3 states that had vetoes, take up a single issue and act on it. I've never seen that happen in the absence of a federal mandate like the Help America Vote Act or the Military Overseas Voter Empowerment Act. So I hope that that will set a little bit of context for the discussion to come, and I'm going to let these guys debate the merits of voter ID, and I'm going to sit back and be nonpartisan.
Thanks, Jennie. That was great. Tova, why don't you begin the discussion?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having us all here, and thank you all for coming. So the title of this evening's discussion is Vote Suppression, Vote Fraud, and the Future of Voter ID. I've just published a book called The Politics of Voter Suppression, so I hope that we can really talk about the efforts by the Republican Party and its supporters to exclude certain people from what is a great democracy that are going around the country right now, and not just voter ID and voter fraud, and have that debate back and forth, which we've been having for a long time. But having said that, let me take my few minutes of my opening remarks to make clear what I believe on this matter, because I believe it's been wrongly portrayed, and then hopefully we can move on to some of the realities of our election system. First of all, I have never said and don't believe that there is no election fraud in the system. I think there is. I think that there are problems with absentee ballot fraud to some extent. I think there are certainly problems with the voter registration system. I think there's vote buying that occasionally goes on, usually again with absentee ballot. But what I will say is that voter impersonation fraud, which is the only type of fraud that would be addressed by a voter identification law, as Jennie has explained, is almost non-existent. And there has been study after study after study about this, including one that just came out where they basically investigated all the allegations that have been made since 2000 and found that there were exactly 10 cases of voter impersonation fraud. So when people talk about voter fraud, whether it's in this discussion here or anywhere else, be very careful to hear exactly what it is they're talking about, if they're talking about voter impersonation fraud or something else. I should also say, though, that I don't think voter identification is in theory or in principle a terrible idea. I think the way states are going about it is very, very, very wrong. They're basically cherry-picking who it is they want to allow to vote by requiring types of ID that certain populations just don't have, and it would be extremely difficult for them to get it, if not impossible, and it's particularly the poor and the elderly. I do a lot of international work now, and there are countries that do require a national ID card in order to vote. The places where they have this and they don't end up disenfranchising large groups of the population are where they invest the resources and really put a lot into sure every single person in that country has that card. So for example, they will travel to places in the Amazon where the only way you can get there is by boat to register and get the cards to the 30 people who live there. Now, when I am convinced that people who are pro-voter ID are willing to go ahead and have a very expensive, huge, federally run program by the government that would ensure that every single person who's eligible to vote could get a voter ID, then I would be willing to have that conversation. And when I hear people talk cavalierly about how, oh, you know, everybody has ID, or you need ID to rent a video or something like that, I just feel like these people must not have any sense at all of how certain communities in this country live. And I'll tell you, this really hit me. I don't know how many of you were watching during the Republican convention when Ann Romney started talking about how she and Mitt had to eat tuna fish on an ironing board during college. And I just kind of thought to myself, well, they don't know, they don't get it. I'm sitting here at Harvard, I've got my suit on, and they're putting me up at the Charles tonight, and I certainly have my ID, but I recognize, I know that there are people in this country who don't live like me, but they have the same right to vote. And I just want to make one other thing clear before we get started. I'm not ashamed to say, very bluntly, that voting is a right, it's not a privilege. You hear a lot of people this year talking about it as a privilege. And it's actually ordinary citizens believing this now, and it looks like they're making it so that voting is, if it's a privilege, it's only the domain of the worthy, or you have to earn it in some way. And it ends up that basically the politicians are choosing the electorate rather than the electorate choosing their leadership. The civil rights movement was for the right to vote. The suffragettes on the streets at the turn of the 20th century were fighting for the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act is called the Voting Rights Act. So it's not a privilege, it's a right. And I think it's being portrayed that way so that if it's a privilege, well, then it's not wrong to put up obstacles and make people earn it. I don't see it that way. And I'll hopefully talk more about what I do believe in, which is I write about in my book called The Voter Inclusion Principle, which basically says that that laws can be used and created and passed that increase participation. That is generally allowable, even if that will only benefit one party over another. It's inherently a good thing. But it is not legitimate to suppress the votes of the other side. And so I talk a lot about how you can evaluate different election reforms that are supposed to either make voting more fair or more accurate by using what I call the voting inclusion principle, which is basically that it's legitimate to increase voter participation as long as there is no countervailing value that is then jeopardized, and that has to be based on real facts, real data, and not allegations, not mythologies, and not things that are developed through some kind of an echo chamber. And I'll be happy to talk about that some more when we get into the discussion.
Thanks, Tova. John?
Well, I think the most productive thing we can do is not to have this an issue of right versus left, but a real discussion about how to improve our voting system, all parts of it. When the only bipartisan voter legislation that's passed in recent years, the Help America Vote Act, was signed into law, as Chris Dodd, the Democratic senator from Connecticut, says, the goal of our election should be to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat, and we can do both. Now, I know you're going to hear a lot of malign motives ascribed to some of these laws and some of these debates. I'd like to present to you some countervailing evidence that this is not quite as polarized an issue as you've been told. Andrew Young, who was the UN ambassador and the confidant of Martin Luther King, supported the Georgia ID law. Supported it because it included a vigorous outreach effort, including mobile vans that would be sent around the state to senior citizen homes and other places to get people ID. He told me, very bluntly, if there are people out there who don't have ID, we are doing them a favor by getting one. And rather than have this polarizing debate where millions of dollars are spent on lawsuits and millions of dollars are spent on publicity campaigns, if we all contributed to supporting a program of outreach, we could actually solve the problem. However much we might disagree how big it is, how many people have ID or don't have ID. And I've traveled around the country for this book, and there are a lot of voices in this book that you haven't probably heard of yet. Harold Metz, the only African-American state senator in Rhode Island. He sponsored the photo ID bill, which takes effect in 2014 in Rhode Island, whose legislature is 8-1 Democratic. The bill was passed through the State House in Rhode Island by the only African-American speaker that body has ever had, Gordon Fox. It was signed by that notorious right-wing radical Lincoln Chafee. Rhode Island had a serious voter fraud problem, and it included, according to Mr. Metz and Mr. Fox, voter impersonation. Now, voter impersonation is not as common, not nearly as common as absentee ballot fraud. I agree with Tova on that. But it doesn't mean we can't take steps to prevent a problem that is so hard to detect. The Pew Research Center says we have almost 2 million dead people on the voter rolls in this country. Now, I can assure you that if you go to a polling place in a state that has no ID law, and you know the name of a dead person who's on that list and it's public record, I can assure you that you can vote in that person's name and they're not likely to complain. I believe we should honor the dead. I do not believe in representation without respiration. The Pew Research Center also says that 1 out of 8 voter registrations in this country are either invalid or contain serious errors. That is something, regardless of party, we should be concerned about. And again, I agree with Tova. You go to places like Noxubee County, Mississippi, Greene County, Alabama. Here there are political machines that provide bad public services, bad schools, bad roads. They crush the hopes and aspirations of the often poor and dispossessed people there. When those people sometimes rise up and try to change their form of government, their votes are stolen from them. It's in the book. It's one of the reasons that Arthur Davis, the former Democratic congressman from Alabama, who seconded the nomination of Barack Obama at the Denver Convention, and who was the first Democratic congressman outside the state of Illinois to endorse Barack Obama for president in 2008, why he finally came out last year and said, I can't take this anymore. The real voter suppression in this country, I've seen it in my district, which includes Selma, the place where we have the Voting Rights Museum. It is where people have their votes suppressed by political machines and they are kept downtrodden by a political machine where if you try to fight City Hall, it will steal your democracy. We spend a lot of time in this country making sure we don't have counterfeit currency. The Secret Service's main job is not protecting the president, it's protecting our currency. The currency of democracy are our votes. I think we can make it easy to vote. I think we can streamline the voter registration system. I think we can make improvements in it. We can make it easier to vote, even than it is now, where you just send in a postcard to register. But we also need to spend some time making sure that, especially in places where this is an ingrained tradition, Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, that we can also prevent voter fraud. I do not support those states that just passed an ID bill. It has to be accompanied by 2 other components. This is a triad. We have to clean up absentee ballot fraud. Kansas, for example, Pennsylvania, they have passed laws. You have to include the last few digits of your driver's license or social security number. Basically, everyone has one of those. We also have to clean up the voter registration rolls. There are over 160 counties in this country where there are more adults registered to vote than the Census Bureau says are adults over the age of 18. We call that a clue that the mischief. It is very depressing to go to a place like Detroit, where Kwame Kilpatrick was the mayor, and he is now currently on trial for federal corruption charges. We could have gotten rid of Kwame Kilpatrick and his corrupt political machine when he ran for re-election. A reformer ran against him from the city council. But there was absentee ballot fraud, there was other fraud. Fraud so much, the city clerk of Detroit had to be removed from office because of all of the fraud that she either allowed or perpetrated. I have to say, I think this is an issue where we can come to a lot more agreement than the polarized debate. And I'm here to tell you, I don't think any one party has clean hands on this. There is Republican voter fraud. I mentioned it in my book. In Clay County, Kentucky, just the other day, the presiding judge who runs the county, he's basically the county executive, the school superintendent, and the city council were all convicted of voter fraud, all Republicans. They had been captured by a methamphetamine gang that basically said the only way we're going to be left alone is if we steal enough votes that we can run all of law enforcement in this county. So, regardless of where it is, regardless of whether it's Greene County, Alabama, where it's a Democratic machine, or Clay County, Kentucky, where it's a Republican machine run by a methamphetamine gang, we can be concerned about both things. There are two civil rights. There's the right to not be intimidated or prevented or blocked from voting. We fought a civil rights struggle over that. We've passed the Voting Rights Act. We need to preserve those gains. There's also another civil right that each and every one of you have. You can have your vote canceled out. You can be disenfranchised if someone votes who shouldn't be voting. A felon, for example, who's not eligible. A non-citizen. Someone who's dead. Someone who doesn't exist. You can have your vote canceled out that way too. We can protect both civil rights. We can make it easy to vote, and we can make it hard to cheat.
Alex.
Let me try to make 3 points here. First, I'm impressed with the way in which we're starting out in this week. Can't we all come together and agree, folks, a manner? And I think that that's really commendable. I think that there is a lot that we can agree on. I mean, our registration system in the United States is a mess. There are states where many more people are registered to vote than live. I used to live in the city of Durham, North Carolina, where there was a significant problem of that time. And I think that there are pockets of fraud and a bunch of other problems involved with, in elective elections in this country. But I think that we do want to do some focusing on the wave of laws that has been passed in the last couple of years and on the current political situation. And the wave of laws that are passed in the last couple of years seem, in a great many different respects, to have partisan intent and are desired to have partisan consequences. Now, the Rhode Island law was mentioned, and I actually think the Rhode Island law is a pretty good law. But it's also not the most typical law, and say in contrast to Pennsylvania, nobody in Rhode Island said we're passing this law in order to elect Mitt Romney, which is what a high-ranking official did say in Pennsylvania. I think that we also all probably agree, and I'm actually optimistic in this conversation, that it would be quite possible to implement some kind of ID system and some kind of reformed registration system, which would take this really quite pernicious issue out of the realm of politics. I mean, it has been, it's been there for a long time, and it's been really very insidious since 2000. And I agree with John completely. This is solvable. Other countries do have voter IDs. For example, I've for a number of years been saying that that I was not against voter ID per se, that the devil is always in the details. The question is exactly how the law is going to operate, exactly how people are going to get the ID. Whose responsibility is it? If there were an ID system, as Tova referred to, where the state, public authorities took responsibility for guaranteeing that everybody got an ID, I would have no problem for that. It works in a lot of countries. IDs don't have to be suppressive. So that's kind of one of sort of 3 quick points I want to make. The second point is that I think it's also important to look at the context in which laws passed. And let me ask you to do a thought experiment about, take an ID law which is being passed, and the ID law says you have to present, take a strict ID law. You have to present current government-issued photo ID of certain specified sorts. And suppose you had this law passed in a country which looked really a lot like your ideal democracy, a small country with 85 to 95% turnout rates, which had been encouraging everybody, including poor people, to vote for dozens and dozens of years, maybe hundreds of years, and had been really where all political parties had been intent on trying to mobilize all voters and increase political participation. You took that law, put it in that setting. Then take that same law and put it in a different setting. And put it in a setting where the history of that particular country was a history where in most of its history, the country was profoundly discriminatory, where erected one barrier after another to the participation of people of color and poor people, and kept changing the laws in a variety of ways to achieve that objective over a period of nearly 200 years. I think the way you would evaluate those laws would depend on which of these two imagined countries they were in. Now, speaking as an American historian, I have to say that I think the U.S. looks a lot more like the second country than like the first country. And let me lead that into a third point that I want to make, and this will be controversial, or should be. It's to address a question I'm often asked, because I've been writing about voting rights for the last 20 years, but I've been writing a lot about voter suppression and linked issues. And people ask me, well, why is this happening? And it's also a question which I try to get my students to focus on, which is, I say, the historian's question, because here at the Kennedy School, historians are an extremely rare breed. We're indeed an endangered species. Almost one person went on paternity leave this year, and that cut the size of the history department by 50%. I try to say to my students, the historian's question is to ask, why did something happen when it happened? Okay, it's a way. I think it's a way to get an analytic purchase on something. So if we ask about this new wave of laws, if we say, why are these laws being passed now? Why in the last 10 years or the last 7 or 8 years? Why are we getting this wave of laws? And I want to offer some what I think are some underlying preconditions, and then talk about a couple of precipitants. The underlying preconditions, and here I'm going to say very explicitly, I am also invoking historical analogies from the late 19th century in the South as well as the North. You know the Southern story. Blacks are disfranchised wholesale after they are enfranchised by the 15th Amendment. And then there's a period of contestation for a couple decades, and then there is wholesale disenfranchisement. What happens in the North in the late 19th century is basically economic barriers to voting are removed, and then you get an enormous flood of immigration, at which point in the North there is a tremendous reaction against universal suffrage, and the first attempts at real voter suppression occur. The phrase vote suppression first becomes current in the English language in the 1880s and the 1890s. Well, if we talk about the current wave of laws, I think that the two preconditions are the enfranchisement of African Americans in the 1960s, which changed the political dynamics of the South and gave political power and potential political power to African Americans in a lot of states where they had none. And the second precondition was an enormous wave of immigration, yet again, starting in subsequent decades, changing the social composition of the electorate in profound ways. What we have seen, if you compare the social composition of the electorate today or for the last 10 years to the American electorate in 1960, you are looking at two very different worlds. And even aside from changing attitudes, as a footnote, the electorate of 1964 never could have elected Barack Obama. Okay? Only the changes in laws and the expansion of the electorate permitted something like that to happen. So I think that what we're seeing part is a set of changes in the social composition of the electorate, which in the current circumstances, it wouldn't have to be this way. One major party has found to be threatening because most of those people, in fact, are to the extent that they are voting for Democrats. I think there have then been two other precipitants, if you will. One were the efforts that were finally passed in the 1990s to make it easier for people to vote. The National Voter Registration Act being the most well-known. But early voting starts to come in the 1990s. There were a variety of measures which finally succeeded in the 1990s. There were other attempts earlier. In the 1970s, Jimmy Carter had a bill that he wanted to really encourage voting, and he was shocked when he unveiled this thing, and it turned out that not only most Republicans were against it, but half of the Democratic Party was against it too. I mean, he was really quite surprised by that. But some of these things bore fruit and became easier to register and to vote. And the final precipitant, I would say, was the 2000 election, because what the 2000 election taught everybody was the old cliche that every vote counts, right? I mean, the control of the national government could hinge on less than 0.1% of the vote on one state. And what political professionals know, and it's an unfortunate truth, and I don't think we can do too much about this, is that every vote count means that A, it's extremely important to get your voters to the polls, but B, you can do just as much good by preventing the opposition's voters from getting to the polls. And that, unfortunately, is a sad truth of American politics. Let me stop there.
Jennie, let me ask you just a quick question on the top. There's one of the things that all three of the speakers said was, after you spoke, was that there is some room for agreement in theory. People could come together to improve the system. There's some overlap in the agreement. Have you seen in any of the states? I mean, Rhode Island obviously is one example, or maybe a unique example, but an example of Republicans and Democrats doing something together. Are there any states that are approaching voter election reform in any kind of bipartisan manner, or is it for the most part been this sort of partisan line effort, depending on who's in charge, either stopping, passing, that sort of thing? I'm curious. I don't actually know, so I thought that.
Well, two examples come immediately to mind for voter ID. Those are New Hampshire and Virginia. So in 2011, New Hampshire, the legislature passed a very strict photo ID law, and the governor vetoed it. And they came back this year and passed what is actually a quite unique voter ID law. It's not matched by any other state in the country, and it's much more moderate than what we're talking about in states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. So that was an example, I think, of some bipartisan cooperation to achieve a compromise on voter ID. And then we have Virginia. Virginia also tried to pass a very strict voter ID law this year. And as it made its way through the legislative process, what came out in the end was sort of a hybrid. They actually added, Virginia had a voter ID law going into this, and they added a bunch of non-photo ID options to expand the pool of potential IDs that you could bring to the polls, making it more likely that most voters will have one of those IDs.
Like utility bills and credit cards and things like that?
Well, yeah, utility bills and paychecks and
that's how Kentucky's law was like that.
Yeah, things like that. Most people are going to have one or more of the things on that list, I think. But what they also did was make it strict. So if you don't bring one of those to the polls, you cast a provisional ballot, and it's not going to get counted unless you eventually show that ID to an election official.
Okay. John, you said you wanted to.
Well, the most comprehensive bipartisan commission on this subject was the Carter-Baker Commission in 2005. Equal numbers of appointees from Democrats and Republicans. I was an expert witness before it. Voter ID passed 18-3. Bipartisan consensus with only 3 dissenters. Now, we can argue about what kind of ID. I agree, devil's in the details. But Jimmy Carter, had a very interesting conversation with him. He said, my first election was stolen from me by voter fraud. I had to have a federal judge come in and throw out the incumbent who'd been seated and put me in. So I care about this issue. I support voter ID. Jimmy Carter. That commission became the basis for much of the opinion that John Paul Stevens, the most liberal member of the Supreme Court, wrote upholding the constitutionality of voter ID. John Paul Stevens. Kansas, they had consensus. The majority of the Democratic legislators in Kansas voted for the strict ID law in that state. In New Hampshire, Democrats were very involved in shaping the ID law. Now, we've heard a lot about Pennsylvania. Look, when the judge refused the injunction against the Pennsylvania ID law, there were 12 witnesses who appeared and said, we can't vote. We're going to be disenfranchised. The judge went through the circumstances of each of those witnesses and found there was an easy way they could vote. Pennsylvania's law is very simple. Yes, you have to have a government-issued ID. That applies to the military that might not have an ID. It applies to a range of IDs, including student IDs, if they meet certain specifications. You can always vote absentee. You don't have to show an ID. You have to provide part of a driver's license number or part of a social security number. You forget your ID. You show up at the polls. You cast a provisional ballot. You don't necessarily have to go back and make a special trip. You can send it by email. You can send it by fax. You can send it by regular mail. You can show up in person. Let's say you don't have the $15 or $18 to get the birth certificate to get a state-issued ID. In Pennsylvania, they have a special affidavit. You show up, you sign the affidavit and says, I'm indigent. I lack the money to get the documentation to get a state ID. They will count your vote. The judge went through all 12 of these witnesses and said, you can vote. The lead witness the ACLU presented on this was a 93-year-old woman who had her purse stolen. And she said, I can't vote. The morning after the judge's decision, she took the bus down to the local DMV. They didn't know she was coming, no special treatment. She got her ID in less than 25 minutes, and it was on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer's Metro section. And she waited until the decision, because obviously her lawyers blew a gasket when she did this. She demonstrated how easy it was to get an ID. Look, anecdotes, we can have dueling anecdotes all we want. But it is a lot less difficult to get an ID, and there are a lot fewer people with an ID. American University study, 3 states, there are probably less than 1%, less than even half of 1% in most states, people who lack an ID. And that should be common sense. The Brennan Center's opinion that 25% of African Americans lack proper ID to vote, is there anyone who really believes that? How patronizing to claim that 25% of African Americans currently lack an ID to vote. How do they am I going to be interrupted?
Well, you're filibustering.
Well, I took less time than you did. Bottom line, it is a lot less partisan and a lot less polarizing, and I'm the only person on this panel with my opinion, so I had to get that out.
Sure. Tova.
John has an amazing way of making things seem really reasonable
Because they
that I'm
are.
not sure I can match.
Because they are.
Because they're not. I can't begin. The misrepresentation of the situation in these states is amazing. In Pennsylvania, we know that there are some 750,000 people who don't have the kind of identification that this law requires. And in fact, let's not talk about anecdotes. Let's talk about data. The data that the state of Texas itself provided to the Department of Justice, because it had to have their law pre-cleared, demonstrated that hundreds of thousands of people did not have the ID that they needed in order to meet Texas's requirements. Let's talk about Pennsylvania. As I said, 750,000 people do not have the kind of ID. Let's say that's wrong. Let's say that's wrong. Let's say it's half that. Let's say it's 350,000 people who don't have the ID. Let's say it's 30,000 people who don't have the ID. The parties in the Pennsylvania case, including the state of Pennsylvania that enacted the law, have both stipulated in court that there has never been a case of impersonation fraud in the state of Pennsylvania in their entire history. So I ask you, even if it's 1/100th of the amount of people who don't have the ID that they say don't have the ID, but there's never been a case of impersonation fraud, why are we disenfranchising these people? In these other states, it wasn't that there was this great bipartisan agreement on how this all should come out. What happened is that Republicans in these legislatures tried to ram through, right after the 2010 elections, state after state, strict government-issued photo ID laws, one after another, and groups, organizations, yes, mostly Democrats, fought tooth and nail because they knew that there were so many people, the poor, African Americans, yes, because they are more likely to be poor, not because they're African American per se, Latinos, young people, the elderly. The most stories you hear about now are the elderly who don't have birth certificates. Pennsylvania is very unique in having this program where, yes, you can get a birth certificate and then get an ID. Do you know how many different trips and papers you have to fill out and all sorts of obstacles and mazes you have to go through? The stories are incredible if you read them. The steps people have to go through in order to end up with their free ID in Pennsylvania. This is not how it should be working in this democracy of ours. People should be able to vote without being put through so many hurdles and obstacles that it is virtually impossible, if not impossible, for them to vote because they're poor, they lack the resources, they live in rural areas, they're the elderly. That's just not the democracy that I believe in.
But Tova, the judge found that any elderly person who lacks a birth certificate and has any trouble getting a state-issued ID can cast an absentee ballot. They don't have to show an ID. All they have to do is provide the last few digits of a social security number, which presumably the elderly are collecting, or a driver's license number. Why is that a barrier to voting if you can cast an absentee vote without showing an ID?
But we've just agreed that absentee ballots are the problem.
No, I have said absentee ballots are the problem. I am fine as long as you provide the last 5 digits of a government identifier number. But the point is that no one elderly is going to be prevented from voting. They can cast an absentee ballot. They don't have to show an ID. Is that correct? Yes. Right?
Oh, yes, it's very true.
So they don't have to show an ID?
That most people in these states that have ID laws, people with who vote absentee don't have to show an ID law. And guess what? Whites cast absentee ballots at a rate about 3-to-1 to African Americans. Republicans think of the absentee ballot vote as their constituency. There are a lot of people who don't want to cast an absentee ballot, who want to go to the polls and go and cast their ballot because they have a history of not being allowed to do so in the past. And I don't think they should be deprived of that right.
But they can cast an absentee ballot without showing an ID, correct?
Again, I go back to you can't have it both ways.
I know Alex wants to jump in, and we want to bring the audience in. And there's a lot more of this discussion, but I think the questions from the audience will draw out.
Just on this one specific point, to my knowledge, you can't go to the polls and be turned down and then apply for an absentee ballot. Most states, you have to apply for an absentee ballot many weeks before. So that the case of the person who has been voting, because we're talking about changes in laws, the person who has been voting for a number of years happens not to have the ID and goes to vote and is prevented from voting, is not remedied by then saying to them, well, next time you can cast an absentee ballot.
All I will say is the judge in Pennsylvania profoundly disagreed with you in his opinion.
And that case is being appealed as we speak.
Yes, and the High Court will agree with the judge who went through all of those 12 witnesses presented and said there's an easy path for every one of them to vote.
So let's bring all of you into the discussion here. One of the great features of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum is that every speaker, every panelist has to subject themselves to questions from the audience. So we have...
Now I'll turn into this pinata.
Yeah.
I'm expecting
John's ready. So we've got 2 microphones here on the floor. We have 2 on the stairs in the box. We do have a couple of ground rules, though. First, please identify yourself. So tell us your name, what affiliation you have. No, we don't need. That's not a stipulation. We only have 3. Let's see. And keep your question short. Questions end in a question mark, and they usually aren't with the "Don't you agree?" question mark after a speech. Also, I neglected to recognize the Ash Center, who was a co-sponsor of tonight's event. And so we really appreciate their help. So we'll start over here, and we'll just work our way around the microphones. And No, you do, because we're streaming it live on the internet and recording it for posterity.
I want people to hear what I'm going to say, so I'll use the microphone. My name is Zachary Herring. I'm a senior right now. I live in Lowell House, which is a great house. But my question really has to do about why this is happening right now. I don't really care about what people say about the constitutionality about it. I am extremely upset that people are trying to fool me and convince me that this is about, the law and enforcing a law when this isn't really a problem, and it hasn't been a problem for a while. I think the real issue is that people are trying to steal an election by covering it up and saying that this is about doing what's right, and when it's really wrong. And I feel like it's a step backwards in that we're literally trying to do what was done in the past during the Jim Crow laws. So I'm standing here in 2012 wondering why this is actually happening.
There are academic studies that show we're a more polarized country and we have more close elections. 537 votes in Florida in 2000 is the premier example. I just came from debating the district attorney of Minneapolis on this issue. Minnesota is going to vote on voter ID this November. The polls show 65% of the people support it. By the way, the latest Washington Post poll on this subject, 74% of Americans support voter ID. It passes in 37 out of 38 demographic groups, 65% African Americans, 64% Hispanics, 60% of Democrats. Minnesota had a real problem. Al Franken was seated by 312 votes. We learned after the whole contest was finished, 1,100 felons voted illegally in that election. Illegally. We can't be sure how they voted, but they certainly could have swayed the result. These cases were brought to prosecutors. They could only prosecute those who said, not only did I know I couldn't vote as a felon, but I did it anyway, and what's it to you, copper? So anyone who did it as by mistake was not prosecuted. We now have almost 200 prosecutions in that state, in that election, of people voting illegally as felons. 66 more in the pipeline, dozens more being investigated. We could end up with more people convicted of voting illegally in that election than the margin of victory. In 19 Minneapolis precincts, there were more votes cast than voters who showed up at the polls. You talk about utility bills. An election judge testified, I saw someone vouch for hundreds of people at a polling place, and I don't believe they were eligible voters. I really think there could be a problem if the election is really close. And our elections are getting closer and closer, and I think it was tragic that we had a president elected in 2000 that over 40% of the American people thought was elected illegitimately. It can happen in the other direction. The way to solve that and the way to get rid of some of this poisonous bitterness is to have an election system, as the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in 2008, where people have a support for the integrity of the process and don't question it.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm really glad that you brought up Minnesota and the issue of ex-felons. We have just seen an example of what I brought up in the very first moment that we got here today. Be careful to listen what kind of fraud people are talking about. John has been talking about people who have been convicted of a felony in their past, who don't know that they're not allowed to vote, who are not eligible to vote, and mistakenly cast the ballot. Please tell me what this has to do with voter ID. Please tell me how this will prevent fraud with a voter ID card. Okay, so again, this is a perfect example. Talk about all different kinds of fraud and then move into what we need is a voter ID.
Tova,
And let me address Minnesota.
Everyone who was convicted,
John, let her finish.
everyone who was convicted did it purposefully, and they admitted that they knew what they were doing.
I would have loved to have been at the Hennepin County DA because he has been quoted as saying that there was absolutely 0 cases of fraud in Minnesota in 2008, that all of those cases and all of those allegations of the 1,100 ex-felons voting were found to be completely baseless, and that's why they were not prosecuted.
But his office prosecuted 38 of them under his jurisdiction.
Out of 1,100.
No, just one county.
Including Minneapolis. It's 1 out of 5 people in Minnesota live in Hennepin County.
Let's get past Minnesota. And sounds like we could go on all night. I think there's a lot of.
Can I just make one
Yeah, you can
last
make.
remark?
Yeah.
What also I don't understand is if there's such a problem with ex-felons voting, why isn't the answer to that to allow people to vote once they have served their time in prison and get rid of these laws that don't allow people to have their voting rights once they've served their time?
Matt.
Hi, my name is Matt Shuham. I'm a sophomore at the college. I imagine most of the questions will be for John because I know the makeup of Cambridge and of Harvard. And I think the question comes back to what Professor Keyssar said. Why is it happening and when is it happening? And if the intent of these laws is to crack down on in-person voter fraud, why is it happening only a few days before the election actually occurs? Why are we hearing about this now instead of in 2009, say? And if the intent is to, enliven our democracy and to make sure that no one cheats, how are we not explaining to our citizens how to get a photo ID? The reality is that if there are 750,000 people in Pennsylvania that now can't vote, there are only 12 of them that get a federal judge to explain how to vote. There are still 700,000 that don't know what to do. It seems like, because it's happening right now, the intent is to disenfranchise.
The first strict voter ID law passed in 2006. Georgia's passed around the same time. Those were the laws that went before courts. The Georgia law was upheld by a democratically appointed judge. The Supreme Court voted 6-3. John Paul Stevens wrote the opinion. Those laws we've been seeing that for the last 10 years. In fact, there's been an acceleration of election laws, as the NCSL person said, since 2000, the Florida result. Why did Canada pass an ID law recently? I went up to Canada. They started to have real voter fraud problems. And Canada, that repository of great intolerance, decided to have a voter ID law. Their laws aren't as strict as some of ours, but they're stricter than some of ours. Why did Mexico pass an ID law recently, after the 2000 election in Mexico? Because they had a voter fraud problem. This is happening not just in the United States, it's happening in our neighbors.
Can I?
Well, Alex, on the way
Sure.
now.
Yeah, again, And to partly address your question, and was what I tried to talk about before, the fact that other countries are adopting ID laws does not mean that the ID laws that are being adopted in the United States over the last 2 years are fair or just or nonpartisan. Okay? In France, you've had to present the carte d'identité to vote, since 1940. That doesn't prove that Pennsylvania's law is a good law. And there's a lot of slippage in the argument that's been going on. We can talk about, it seems to me there's two different issues. One is to talk about what we think a good anti-fraud system and voter ID system might look like. And another is to talk about these current laws and what their purpose is. And you can't completely conflate those two different subjects.
I just wanted to mention, a lot of what my book is about is how these exact same things have been going on for the last 150 years. It's actually very much a historical book. And it's almost like nothing that you see going on today hasn't happened before, sometimes, 100 years ago. And for the first century of our history, it was both the Democrats and the Republicans, and throw in the Whigs if you want to, too, that were doing this. It depended on, what your advantage was as to who could vote. It has been happening, as Alex was alluding to, for the last 50 years, since the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and the enfranchisement of African Americans and the political dynamics that changed during that period that made it so that African Americans and Latinos in particular started voting overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates. So that's part of the answer as to why this has been happening in recent years, because it has been in the interest of the Republican Party to suppress the vote of these constituencies because they vote Democratic. Why it's been happening particularly lately is because in 2010, we saw a landslide election in which a number of the state legislatures got overwhelming majority Republicans in office, and a number of Republican governors won. And so that they finally had the numbers to do what they had been trying to do for several years, which was pass these voter ID laws and other restrictive laws that we should also talk about. They finally got their opportunity, and that's why it's exploded now.
Tova, I only wish I could take you on a walking tour of Providence, Rhode Island, which is only 40 miles from here, and I will introduce you to the Haitian American state legislator who showed up at the polls one day and someone had already voted in her name. I could take you to Harold Metz, the African American state senator who sponsored the photo ID bill, and he will take you to the constituents who came to him with complaints that elections were stolen out from under them. I could take you to Lincoln Chafee, the governor, who said, I did this because minority groups in Providence came to me and begged me to sign the bill. I wish I could take you on a walking tour of Providence, Rhode Island, where you can actually see how minority communities have their rights taken from them by a political machine. And remember, it's called Rogues Island for a reason.
Jenny, yeah.
Just to build on Tova's point, I think that if you remove the controversy from this and you remove the motivation from it, the simple fact that Republicans made huge gains in 2010 explains a lot of why so many states have acted in 2011 and 2012. I mean, this is something that's been on the Republican agenda for a long time, just like a lot of other issues have been on the Republican agenda for a long time, and they got into power in some states for the first time since Reconstruction. More Republicans in legislatures right now than any year since the 1930s. And if the tables turn on us in 2012, which I don't think they really are going to, but if they do and Democrats come back into power in a lot of these state legislatures, they're going to have an agenda too. So that's just the way that politics works. Republicans have wanted to do it for a long time. They had the chance now because they have the majority. They couldn't before.
The first bipartisan commission to study our election laws issued its report in 2005. 18-3, they said voter ID. They also had many other recommendations. The movement, I argue, started with a bipartisan commission co-chaired by Jimmy Carter.
Actually, the first commission I was the staff member of, and it was the Carter-Ford Commission, and it didn't bring up voter ID at all because it wasn't seen as something even worth talking about.
So why did the Carter-Baker Commission bring it up?
Because James Baker got involved.
What about Jimmy Carter? Wasn't he involved? I thought Jimmy Carter was the co-chair.
I'll just leave it there.
Okay.
He supported it.
Thank you very much. My name is Sita Gofard. I'm a sophomore here at the college. So it seems, just watching our debate, at least in our room, there seems to be a general consensus that the proposed voter ID laws amount to some sort of unfair, attempt at suppressing minorities. And there's certainly, a strong argument to be made on that case. However, hypothetically, and looking at the evidence you presented as well, there is definitely, a possibility that, in this election or in future elections, voter fraud could become a greater problem. And so just looking at the solutions and cutting through this debate, what other solutions might exist? What other systems could we devise that would prevent voter fraud from happening, but still maintaining, not gearing towards the full, voter ID laws that people find so, oppressive and unfair?
Well,
What other alternatives are there?
I agree that absentee ballot fraud is a real problem. And I'll ask Tova, if you agree absentee ballot fraud is a real problem, what are your solutions to deal with it?
Oh, actually, in my book, I talk about how, contrary to, other advocates in the voting rights world, I am not a huge supporter either of very liberalized absentee balloting rules necessarily because of this, nor necessarily extreme early voting rules that go on for a month or 5 weeks or so. So that's the answer to that question. But I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is that I think we agree on having to do a real overhaul of the voter registration system in this country, and I think that will go a long way to ensuring confidence in the elections. We are virtually the only democracy in the Western world where the onus is on the individual, on the citizen to register to vote, rather than on the government to ensure that every citizen is registered to vote. And I think what we need to move towards is what other democracies around the world do, which is to have a little bit of less of a maze that the citizenry has to go through, and have the government straighten it out and make it easier. So.
Jenny.
I would agree that voter registration is probably the most likely place to look to prevent voter fraud going forward. And I want to point out two things that are going on right now. One is that states are leaning more and more towards electronic voter registration, completely paperless, where you can go on the internet. I just moved a year and a half ago. I live in Colorado, and I was able to go online and enter my name, my birth date, my driver's license number, and change my voter registration. And making it that easy makes it easier for voters to take the steps they need to take to keep their registration accurate. And it makes it more accurate because there's no lost paper, there's no data entry error. Voter registration is tied to a digital signature in the Department of Revenue or the Department of Motor Vehicles. It's really quite secure and quite accurate. So that's one thing. And the other is the Pew Center on the States has been sponsoring this data sharing effort where states are sharing their voter registration data with each other and trying to identify duplicates and things of that nature, identify voters that have died maybe in another state and their registration remains on the books in a second state. These are things that states can't really do by themselves, and so through cooperation they can clean up their rolls.
I think we have some agreement. I properly implemented, I think those things are fine. I think we should make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. Tova, I commend her. I think Tova has been one of the most intellectually honest of her side on the issue of absentee balloting. I also agree with her. I also agree with her on early voting. Did you know that people in North Carolina started voting last week? I think that's a little early. Just because something can be a good thing doesn't mean we can't have too much of a good thing. Look, let's say you had a dispute with a landlord and you went to court, and let's say it ended up in a jury trial. We now have something like 15% of the population that is going to be eligible for early voting before the first debate is held. Something like 85% will be eligible for some kind of early voting before the last debate is held. If you had a dispute with your landlord and you were in front of a court, a jury trial, and your attorney got up to make your summation, suddenly 3 or 4 of the jurors walked out and said, "We've heard enough," would you feel a little cheated that they didn't hear all the evidence? I think we should at least have early voting that allows people to watch the debates. I'm not opposed to early voting, but early voting on September 2nd of an election year? I think that's ridiculous.
I actually totally agree. And although I do think there should be early voting, I think that this is early. I would say, though, please don't leave off coincidentally or conveniently the last Sunday before the election when African-American churches bring their congregations together to go and vote early on the Sunday before Election Day, as Florida and Ohio have tried to do.
Questioner here.
So I kind of just have a two-part...
And what's your name?
My name is Mike Mon. I'm an MPA here. I have a two-part question, mostly for Tova. Obviously, the Constitution doesn't give us the right to vote. I learned that from Professor Keyssar.
Me too.
You've talked a lot about how that
and he's the star of a great new documentary that will be on PBS called Electoral Dysfunction. He's now a TV celebrity.
Okay. TV star. But knowing that there is no constitutional right to vote, that obviously prohibits us from mandating the federal government or other government entities to expend a lot of resources to get all these people to do what you're talking about right now. So one, given that that's not possible because that's not a constitutionally given right that we have, is that plan that you're suggesting in terms of what government should be doing really feasible? And the second, you've accused John a couple of times that he can't have it both ways. And so I found it rather contradictory when when you were suggesting that all these people find it so hard to go get ID, and yet when he suggested what seemed like a very reasonable solution, that you get an absentee ballot and you fill it out with your Social Security number, you said, well, these people don't want to do that. They want to make the very hard trip to go vote. But that's so contradictory because you're saying, like, they don't want to do it, they can't, it's too oppressive, and when you're given a solution, you say, oh, no, but they don't want to do it's easy, they want to do it's hard, and what you just called oppressive.
Gotcha. Okay, so first of all, it's true that there's no explicit right to vote in the Constitution. And there's a lot of discussion about whether that should be changed, which we should leave for a different forum. But the Supreme Court has made very clear that there is a fundamental right to vote that you cannot take away from people unjustly. And I don't think that the Constitution would interfere with the federal government or any other government providing or spending money in order to provide ID, if that's what you were referring to. I don't think that there's any constitutional barrier there. Is that what you meant?
No, well, you were talking about different ways to get governments to expend a lot of money to go provide all those IDs. Yeah, I think you're the one that gave the example of the Amazon going out to locales. I'd love Professor Keyssar to weigh in as well, kind of. I'm not familiar with the Supreme Court saying that you have a right to vote, because my understanding, for example, in the vote for president, any state legislature can actually override that if they don't give it to you, and we don't have any right to vote.
In that sense, right, and I'll allow Alex to answer the rest of that. Let me just get to your second question. This does go to anecdotes, but I think that they're meaningful in this instance at least. There are particularly African Americans in this country who were denied the vote so outright for so long that it is very important to them to go to the polls and cast their ballot. And a lot of people are uncomfortable with absentee ballots. Actually, another thing I bring up in the book that people don't realize is that there is much greater error rate with respect to absentee ballots than casting a ballot at the polls. And so many more mistakes are made on absentee ballots and they end up not getting counted than when you go to the polls. So there are a lot of reasons why someone might not want to vote absentee. I don't know. I think people should, if they want to go to the polls and cast their ballot and participate in that very fundamental, basic part of our American democracy, that they should be able to do that.
I agree. I guess my question, you made it seem as though it was infeasible for them to be able to travel, and that put an overwhelming onus on them to have to go somewhere to process something in order to get ID. Yet then you act as though it's not an overwhelming onus to have to travel elsewhere. So that doesn't seem... I understand that if they want to go vote, that's fine. But that doesn't make sense, that then if they can do that, then they can certainly go somewhere else to get an ID as well.
I'm not sure I follow your question, but look, if the Pennsylvania law or any of these other laws end up standing in court and they go forward for this election, yeah, people should vote absentee if that's what they have to do, but I don't think that they should have to. And Alex, if you want to talk more about the constitutional issue.
Just let me try to unravel some of the confusion which I helped to cause. But I mean, we were talking about this in class today and earlier this week. I mean, the absence of an affirmative right to vote in the U.S. Constitution, which I think is very important, does, it seems to me, make it easier for various states to take policy steps and to pass laws that in some sense burden that right, such as the voter ID laws. If the Bill of Rights included a right to vote, I think that the legal arguments about the implementation of a lot of electoral procedures would look quite different. The absence of it at the same time, I don't think would be an impediment to the federal government investing a lot of resources into trying to make a registration system and an ID system work as well as possible. You don't need that in order to do it.
I support vigorous outreach efforts to get everyone an ID. I'll circle back to Andrew Young. We're doing people a favor if they don't have an ID. Think of all the things you can't do without an ID. You can't cash a check. You can't get Social Security. If you go to the doctor, you have to show your ID. Let's get people an ID. Let's end this ridiculous set of lawsuits. I'll stipulate that she's right. There are things we can do to make voter registration easier. I support them. But let's get away from spending all this money on lawyers and partisan bickering. Let's get everyone an ID. Support dramatic outreach efforts. Georgia was good. South Carolina offers a free ride to the DMV to get your ID. They had 23 takers in the last year. Let's get an ID for everyone. I support vigorous outreach efforts.
But let's do that first before we start requiring it.
And I guess, and if I could maybe add a little more to Alex's answer, the federal government does do, we have conflicts. For example, electioneering laws, which are infringement of a First Amendment right, are constitutional if reasonable to protect the right to vote. So there are some clear Supreme Court cases that allow the federal government to take some things on, in addition to the spending power. And we were the defendant in a state. I inherited a case on electioneering laws, so I know way too much about them. This gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Saul Tannenbaum. I'm a citizen of Cambridge, and I want to thank Harvard and the Kennedy School for opening events like this to the public so we can all
Glad to have you.
listen and learn. Glad to be here. And John, this is a question for you. We've met a couple of times at progressive events, and you're a really nice guy, so I don't really mean to use you as a piñata. But you just, I mean, you couldn't have segued to my question better. I've always thought of you as a small government conservative, yet you're sitting there saying outreach for larger official ID. I don't understand how, in a principle of limited government, affirmative outreach to get people official ID. You're shaking your head.
Look, conservatives often engage in cognitive dissonance. They support. They do. No, I'm not.
You mean hypocrisy?
I'm not a conservative.
You mean hypocrisy?
I will confess, I have not voted for a Republican for president in over 25 years. I'm not a Republican. Never been registered one. Get up. Conservatives engage in cognitive dissonance. They support a huge military-industrial complex where we have military bases in 140 countries. I'm sorry, 100 countries. And that is clearly big government. So it depends what kind of government you want. Conservatives support big government in all kinds of ways. They want to crack down on the drug laws. They want to crack down on drug use. I am not being contradictory. I support limited government, but I support vigorous and active government for things that really matter. If we're going to prevent counterfeit currency, I think we should prevent counterfeit votes. I believe in supporting, it doesn't cost that much. I mean, first of all, I don't think 25% of African Americans lack a proper ID. I just think that's made up. And for those who don't, for those who can't go to the doctor, can't cash a check, can't travel, we are doing them a positive benefit. We are expanding the rights of citizens by getting them an ID because there's a whole lot of stuff in life they can't do, and only one of those things would be voting.
But somehow they manage to live without those things. So I don't really, I mean, you can sit there and say...
You don't have an ID?
Actually, it's really none of your business whether I have an ID or not. Seriously, it really isn't.
I think you do have an ID.
It's none of your business.
You do have one.
I understand.
You do.
We're not going to have a debate on whether he's got ID or not.
He does.
Holly.
Hi, my name is Holly Flynn. I'm a sophomore in the college, and I'm asking this question on behalf of the JFK Junior Forum Committee. So we've heard a lot tonight about laws that may prevent eligible Americans from voting, but I wanted to ask about those Americans who are already disengaged from the voting process. What can we do this November to encourage greater turnout for Americans of all political affiliation?
This might be a good question for us to end on, considering the clock. So, Tova, I'll let you start.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue, isn't it? And really, what we should have been sitting here talking about all night was the number of people who don't vote and aren't registered and aren't engaged. And it's a huge problem. I do believe, actually, though, that there are some structural changes that can be made that will encourage greater participation, the cultural and sociological issues notwithstanding. I think, for instance, election day registration is a reform that we could institute that has been meant to increase participation in voting in state after state that's adopted it. I'm sorry, it's the data again, it's getting in the way. So that's the type of thing that I would say. And I think that, you know, a lot of what I read about also in the book is how I think it's really incumbent on the parties. One of the problems is that it's much easier to just focus on those people who are already registered to vote and regularly vote and target your resources, your campaign resources at the people that you already know about and know will vote, rather than trying to engage people who are not registered and you don't even know what they're going to do. I think that we need to engage more with those people who are not registered and don't vote regularly necessarily. And EDR actually can help to do that because it forces the candidates really to speak to registered voters and people who might show up on election day and register on election day. So I think that's one possibility.
We have a polling worker crisis in this country. The average age of a poll worker is 68 to 70 years of age. They're not going to be with us forever. I think we need to have a national program, and this would not cost very much money. Let's give high school and college credit to people who, as part of their civics instruction, go out and help at the polls. And, you know, we're moving to electronic poll books. Who better to figure out the electronic poll books than the young people? I mean, after all, they've already known every game in the world by the time they're 10. So I think we need to really, we can't depend on the poll worker force that we have. Let's get high school and college kids out there and teach them about our democracy.
I think that's a great idea.
John stole my answer.
Sorry.
I was going to say, a lot of states are actually doing this now. They are, if not giving credit, they're at least allowing high school kids to be excused for the day to volunteer, be a poll worker. And I think it's a wonderful program. It kills two birds with one stone. As he mentioned, it gets able-bodied, technologically savvy people into the polls to make elections happen, and this is an ongoing problem for election officials across the country. And it gets those young people engaged. They see people coming in to vote, they get excited, they maybe earn a little bit of money, and hopefully they'll go forward and be voters for the rest of their lives.
Alex, we'll let you have the last word.
Okay. Well, I agree with everything on this subject that all of my colleagues have said.
Finally.
Right. We finally. And I would mention two other things which are not going to happen by November, but looking ahead. Okay. Get rid of the Electoral College. And reinstitute a military draft. I think
Tough
both
sell on that
of
one.
it's a tough sell. It's a tough sell, but I think particularly among the young, it will heighten interest in politics.
Sounds like we have our two next forum topics.
You know, I don't believe in heightening interest in something by stealing people.
Well, maybe we'll have you on the come back to the forum, John. Well, I know there's a lot of people who wanted to ask questions, but given the hour, we're going to have to conclude the forum tonight. But we're going to continue discussions like this all throughout the semester here. We really appreciate the co-sponsorship and support, and especially on the organizational side with the Ash Center. It was great looking out and seeing a lot of new faces, a lot of students here today. And we're going to continue talking about these kinds of issues formally and informally over the next couple of months. So please join me in thanking our panel for tonight's great conversation. Next Thursday, we've got in our next forum, we're going to talk about Rachel Carson's Silent Spring 50 years later. So we've got that, and then the following day we have a Kennedy School alum who's the head of state of the president of Mongolia who's going to be here. So we look forward to seeing you in the audience. Thanks and have a good evening.